Good evening. Is everyone getting... Good evening. Can everybody hear me? I think so. Good. I'm glad you all passed the test of the fire drill. Purely a ruse to get you to admire the buildings from the outside. But welcome to the Charterhouse. I'm Tom Foakes. I'm the Deputy CEO here, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's 2021 Sir Denis Mahon Essay Prize lecture. This is a particularly appropriate location for the prize in this Baroque setting. And I'm sure you can see this rather wonderful painting by Luca Giordano just next door to me, which has only recently been returned following restoration, so do admire it afterwards. As one of the judges of the judging panel this year, I can safely say that I was particularly impressed by the level of research and the diversity of subject matter. And this evening really recognises the value of the Essay Prize in recognising young scholars. Tonight we will begin with an introduction from Orietta Bonocci-Adam, one of the trustees of the Sir Denis Mahon Foundation. And this will be followed by a brief statement from Gabriella Johnson, the recipient of the 2020 Sir Denis Mahon Essay Prize, who I can't think why you weren't able to present last year. And then Suzanne Marriott, a trustee of the foundation, will then talk about the Essay Prize and announce the winning candidate for this year. So over to you, Orietta.
The Sir Denis Mahon Foundation has been operational now for 10 years, carrying out work in memory of the late world-renowned scholar and philanthropist, Sir Denis Mahon. Sir Denis was a distinguished collector and scholar of 17th century Italian paintings, whose particular interest was in drawing, carving, and conservation. He was born on this day, on the 8th of November, 1910. And it has become a tradition for us to celebrate his birthday every year in conjunction with the Sir Denis Mahon Essay Prize. Over the past 10 years, the Foundation has been exceptionally active thanks to the dedication and hard work of its trustees, our distinguished panel of judges throughout the years, our advisors, collaborators, scholars, artists, and young students. The Foundation has strived to honor Sir Denis's legacy by promoting the education and accessibility of art and art history, and supporting the development of young scholars. It has funded and organized numerous exhibitions, provided grants and prizes, funded a student art school, and made significant donations of funding and artwork to museums across the world. The Foundation now has a dynamic new website to keep Sir Denis's legacy alive and to engage with young scholars, artists, and supporters. Considerable resources have been spent on the placement and accessibility of the Sir Denis Mahon Library and Archive at the National Gallery of Ireland, which remains a major ongoing project for the Foundation. We are very grateful to the National Gallery of Ireland for their continuous efforts and commitment, and we are honored to have Sean Rainbird, its director, with us tonight. The Foundation endows several annual prizes for young scholars and artists. In memory of his passion for painting and drawing, and in recognition of his lifelong support of the Royal Drawing School, the Foundation created the annual Sir Denis Mahon Award to provide a promising outgoing graduate of the Royal Drawing School with a financial award each year. This year, the award was won by the very talented Denis Mahon, Dino X, who I'm delighted to say is with us tonight. To encourage work on ambitious cultural projects and to support students of the City and Guilds of London Art School, the Foundation established an annual grant in Sir Denis's memory, the Sir Denis Mahon Sculptural Project Grant. This year, the award was divided between 3 outstanding students, Rosin Francis, Dan Russell, and Johannes Wagenknecht. And in 2020, the Foundation established the University of Oxford Development Award to fund the tuition fees for a future undergraduate student's MA in History of Art at the University of Oxford, which was Sir Denis's alma mater. And of course, the Sir Denis Mahon Essay Prize, of which you will hear more from my co-trustee, Susan Marjotte. Sadly, due to COVID, we were unable to invite the winner of last year's Essay Prize, Gabriella Johnson, to present her essay, The Elephant in the Room, Simone Vouet's Catoptric Elephant, Originality and the Magic of Optics, as a lecture at Cromwell Place in London. But we are delighted that Gabriella is with us tonight to enable us to celebrate a well-deserved award from last year. And I would now like to invite Gabriella Johnson to say a few words.
Hello, everyone. I'm so grateful to the Sir Denis Mahon Foundation, especially Orietta and Suzanne, for inviting me to this year's award ceremony and for welcoming me to London. I'm honored and beyond elated to have been selected as the recipient of last year's Essay Prize. My winning essay, The Elephant in the Room, Simone Vouet's Catoptric Elephant, Originality, and the Magic of Optics, dives into the world of 17th century anamorphic images, optical science, and elephant iconography to uncover the meaning and function of Vouet's allegorical print, which you see behind me. Vouet's print depicts a demonstration of catoptric anamorphosis, a process in which an elongated image circles the base of a conical or cylindrical mirror. Following refractive laws, the carefully prepared image is reflected in the mirror, and in the case of Simone Vouet's print, a distorted elephant is reflected to the shock and amazement to an audience of bewildered satyrs. I argue that Vouet's Catoptric Elephant was likely a thesis print circulated at a doctoral defense in Rome. It illustrates the early modern belief that optical science led to spiritual enlightenment, or that mathematics and geometry brings one closer to understanding divinity. Vouet's print also speaks to the early modern vogue for collecting foreign or wondrous objects for cabinets of curiosities. The massive elephant is rendered in miniature, shrunken to be part of an optical demonstration. Its presence in the print recalls the elephants who traveled Europe as circus shows and diplomatic gifts, as well as its iconographic allusion to enduring faith. In Vouet's print, the steadfast elephant is the protagonist in a catoptric demonstration that operates as a metaphor for spiritual enlightenment. My paper began at the University of Delaware as a report for a graduate seminar on the issue of originality in Renaissance and Baroque art theory, taught by my PhD advisor, Professor David M. Stone. Catoptric anamorphosis poses a unique challenge for an artist to display their originality, for it requires a mastery of complicated principles of geometry and refraction to turn a distorted drawing into a naturalistic reflection. The artist's ability to create this optical effect is part of the artistry. In many ways, my paper paved the way for the development of my interdisciplinary dissertation entitled Galatea's Realm: The Art of Coral, Shells, and Marine Fossils in Early Modern Sicily, Naples, and the Maltese Islands. In my dissertation, I continue to explore the allegorical language of the Seicento by studying works of art inspired by or made from the sea's creatures. I received the news that I won the 2020 Essay Prize on a very quiet Sunday in October at the height of a new peak of COVID-19 cases in the United States. What was a rather bleak and gloomy day of quarantine became a celebratory sequence of Zooms, FaceTimes, and phone calls. Thanks very much to the judging panel and the Sir Denis Mahon Foundation for finding value and merit in my research. As Orietta said, due to pandemic restrictions, last year's award ceremony was canceled, and I did not deliver my paper as a traditional lecture to a live audience. Instead, I recorded a Zoom presentation in my living room. My recorded lecture is accessible on the Sir Denis Mahon Foundation's website under the Sir Denis Mahon Essay Prize. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriella. And now my co-trustee, Susan Marjotte, will present the prize and the winner of the 2021 Sir Denis Mahon Essay Prize. Thank you.
The Sir Denis Mahon Essay Prize was established in 2010 by Sir Denis's friends and colleagues to honour his 100th birthday and to celebrate the research and the literary work of young scholars. The annual prize of £2,000 is awarded to an essay of distinction which reflects Sir Denis's interest in Baroque and Renaissance art, particularly the work of Guercino, Carracci, Caravaggio and Nicolas Poussin, but also certain key modern, post-war and contemporary artists. We are particularly grateful to the distinguished panel of judges, a number of whom we are delighted to have with us this evening. The Sir Denis Mahon Essay Prize has been presented over the years at such renowned institutions as the Ashmolean, the Fitzwilliam, the Courtauld Institute of Art, the Pinacoteca di Cento, the National Gallery of Ireland, the Museum of the Order of St. John, the British Museum, and the National Gallery in London. And this year we are honoured to hold the Essay Prize here at the venerated Charterhouse. The trustees are delighted to announce that this year's prize, selected from a very high calibre of entries, is awarded to Marjotte Miles with her essay, The Invisibility of the Old Woman Artist, Van Dyck's portrait as Sofonisba Anguissola, in which she discusses the meeting between the young Anthony van Dyck and the celebrated artist Sofonisba Anguissola when she was 96 years old, and how it influenced the extraordinary, sensitive portrait he painted of her. She presents a scholarly and sympathetic interpretation of this work in contrast with other portraits depicting elderly women and the general invisibility of old women artists during that period. Marjotte has recently started a funded PhD in history with the University and Museums of Liverpool on imperial violence and technology in museum collections. She completed an MA in History of Art and Visual Studies at Wolfson College at Oxford, having gained her BA in History of Art at the Courtauld Institute of Art. She is a teaching assistant at the Wallace Collection and the National Gallery in London, delivering study group sessions to AS and A-level students of History of Art, and for Art History Link Up, a registered charity which provides an opportunity for students from diverse backgrounds to learn about and have direct access to visual culture and to open up career and further educational choices through accredited qualifications. Please welcome Marjotte Miles.
Okay, good evening to everyone, and thank you so much for being here. I would like to express my gratitude to the Sir Denis Mahon Foundation for giving me the opportunity to be here this evening. Now, this evening, we are going to be talking about wrinkles, saggy skin, double chins, but don't worry, we will also be exploring a wonderful and intriguing painting that records the encounter between two fascinating artists. In 1624, the 25-year-old Flemish Baroque artist, Van Dyck, met the 96-year-old Italian Renaissance painter, Sofonisba Anguissola. And they're really going to be the protagonists of the lecture this evening. So here are two works, just so you can refresh your memory and remember what the style is like. And during this encounter, which happened in Sicily, Van Dyck recorded this encounter in a notebook, in which he decided to sketch the old artist. He also scribbled down, all around her figure, different pieces of advice that she gave to him. While Van Dyck drew the old artist as wrinkled and hunched, his writings reveal his admiration for Anguissola's vivacity and enthusiasm in sharing her artistic expertise. Now, based on this sketch, Van Dyck later produced an extremely striking and personal portrait of Anguissola. Unlike most of her self-portraits, which show herself as a young woman, Van Dyck's painting captures the artist as old. Van Dyck's image records two extraordinary phenomena. Firstly, it represents the figure of an extremely successful woman artist. The poet, Angelo Grillo, acknowledged how Anguissola's talent defied the limitations of her sex, calling her a miracle of nature. Secondly, the portrait depicts her as an old woman. Now, if a highly skilled woman artist, such as Anguissola, was already considered an exception by her contemporaries, an image of her as an old woman was particularly singular. In their biographies, women artists were often said to die of heartbreak, sadness, or were simply denied an existence after the age of 50. Therefore, Van Dyck's simple but blunt depiction of Anguissola's malfunctioning eyes and her relatively unwrinkled, textured skin remains an oddity among the accepted depictions of women artists throughout the whole of the early modern period. While surviving portraits of elderly women artists are genuinely unheard of, images of old women did circulate, both in paintings and in prints. So here are a couple of examples just to give you an idea of the kind of stereotypes that existed around age. We'll come back to some of these in a bit. So you'll probably be familiar with figures such as Saint Elizabeth or Saint Anne, who are often presented as elderly in popular representations of the Holy Family. In certain cases, we also had an older nun who was particularly venerated for her virtue. Sometimes we have elderly women depicted as widows, and especially when they came from elite families. We'll come back to this work in a little bit. And you'll probably be familiar with biblical heroines such as Judith or Salome, who are depicted with old maids. Sometimes, more rarely, we also see an older woman in domestic scenes, such as Sofonisba's beautiful painting The Chess Game. More popular were vulgar and comic images of old women, presented as witches and hags. Those were widely spread throughout Italy and Northern Europe. The characteristics attributed to old women meant that they were never just portrayed as elderly, but that their age was visibly encrusted in preconceived notions. Now, the wrinkles on Saint Elizabeth's face, for instance, would be there really to emphasize how old she was when she miraculously gave birth to Saint John the Baptist. While wrinkled breasts and swollen faces ridiculed old women and the vanity that they were supposed to embody. Now, by contrast, Van Dyck's image presents Anguissola in a portrait in which the signs of aging are not negatively weighted with such stereotypes. The signs of old age do not invite the viewer to place the sitter within the limited spectrum of pious souls, servants, tokens of lineage, or ridiculously witch-like figures. Preempting Griselda Pollock's desperate call for a face and a body that would itself be a record of time lived, Van Dyck provides us with an image of a woman whose old age is acknowledged and embraced, rather than used to satisfy visual and social conventions, a testimony to a life lived. So let's just look at the work in a bit more detail here. Anguissola in old age, I think, is the sole subject of the painting. The portrait is closely cropped around the sitter's face, emphasizing the stifling effect of her white collar and cream-colored veil. Her eyes stare out vacantly in different directions, possibly evoking the blindness that Van Dyck actually mentions in the text that he writes in his sketch. Nonetheless, I think that those blind eyes echo an earlier emphasis on the power of her sight. I think there's definite thoughtfulness behind the blindness, a testimony to her capacity as an artist. Her pale face is propelled towards the viewer by the black, plain background, and her white veil prevents her black habit from blending into the darkness surrounding her. This image is unsettlingly stark. The pyramidal form of her figures occupies the whole canvas, and her head nearly touches the top of the frame. We can't actually see what her hands are doing, although her eyes, I think, suggest that she is not engaged in any kind of manual activity. Escaping the preconceived models of old age in contemporary representations of elderly women, Anguissola is simply depicted as a woman who lives her old age and the slow decay of her body. Now, I really find the function of this work quite perplexing, because if Van Dyck's only aim was to make a portrait to record his encounter with the artist, his sketch would have surely been enough. If, on the other hand, Van Dyck had wanted to create a portrait to prove that he had met such an illustrious artist in order to increase his own reputation, well, surely he would have made her look a little bit more glam. So, why? Why portray her as a simple old woman? If portraits were designed to celebrate their sitters, an old woman could hardly have been considered at the time an appropriate subject, unless dignified by wealthy possessions or other signs of high status. Why then did Van Dyck represent Anguissola as a so-called unappealing old woman, and how did his portrait engage with contemporary beliefs about age? By further investigating the singularity of Van Dyck's portrait, I think we can really start asking how gendered assumptions about aging were applied to the rare and miraculous women who were admired in their role as artists. Now, because the talent of women artists was often associated for their beauty, grace, and virtue, most biographies denied them any existence as old women. For instance, Vasari's biography of Properzia de Rossi concludes with her dying at a relatively young age, heartbroken by unrequited love. Mancini mistakenly explains how Lavinia Fontana died because of the pain of the death of her daughter, at the age of approximately 50 years. Fontana, in fact, died at the age of 62. By contrast, Raffaele Soprani, who wrote Sofonisba Anguissola's biography in 1674, unusually decides to describe Sofonisba Anguissola's older years. And you might have guessed why, mostly because Van Dyck had paid her a visit. Married, blind, and unable to paint, Anguissola's later years would have otherwise been biographically unimportant in the eyes of someone like Soprani. Soprani explains how Van Dyck used to say that he considered himself very indebted to have conversed with Sofonisba, and confessed to having received much greater instruction from the words of a blind woman than from the works of the most esteemed painters. Here we have a case where we have the validation of Anguissola's expertise by a male, up-and-coming artist, justifying the rest of Soprani's biography. He establishes Anguissola as a great artist and concludes the biography by stating, "I don't know how better to make evident the merit of such a glorious painter than with the testimony of a virtuoso whose works we see idolized by everyone," talking about Van Dyck here. This statement enables Soprani to link two different generations of artists, inscribing Anguissola as a lasting influence within the broader narrative of art history. Rather than wanting to consolidate her already widespread reputation, I think Van Dyck was more concerned with creating a record of his encounter with Anguissola. So, as we said, he initially drew her in this sketchbook, and he used this sketchbook during his 3 first years in Italy, between February 1622 and 1625. Out of the sketchbook 122 pages, only 4 have been identified as preparatory drawings for actual commissioned works. Rather, Van Dyck used the book as a visual diary, in which he drew scenes and artworks he witnessed during his travels. Anguissola appears at the very end of the sketchbook on page 119. Her portrait is literally inscribed within Van Dyck's writings. Her body floats amongst the lines of handwriting. Her crouched torso propels her figure forward from the text with the same coloured ink, which I think unifies sketch and text. Nonetheless, I think it's quite clear here that the words really surround the image. And this kind of indicates that Van Dyck's first reflex during his encounter with Anguissola was to sketch her, before writing the advice that she actually gave to him. Van Dyck kept this sketchbook in his possession throughout his whole life. It was found in his workshop after his death and served as a source of inspiration and as a pattern book throughout his career. Likewise, his later painting of Anguissola is believed to have stayed in his possession until his death, as no contract describing its commission or sale has been found. In fact, the painting was only identified by Oliver Miller in 1969 as Van Dyck's portrait of Anguissola. Now, the lack of information, I think, about the production of the painting and its provenance contribute to the assumption that Van Dyck never sold or separated himself from the portrait. Now, as some of you may know, Van Dyck studied with Rubens from 1613 until his departure for Italy in October 1621. So he painted the portrait of Anguissola in 1624, so only a couple of years later, and Van Dyck would have still been under the influence of his master's style and technique. I think it's good to bear in mind here as well that Northern art was actually really popular in Sicily, and Van Dyck would have still been under the influence of Rubens' style, but also seeing works such as Jacob Jordan's Head of an Old Woman, which also recalls Rubens' style. Yet, by the time that he actually painted Anguissola's work, I think we can really see how Van Dyck has radically departed from Rubens' or Jordan's way of depicting old skin. A 1616 oil sketch by Rubens of an old woman really uses the sitter's profile in order to place the viewer directly in front of a mass of textured skin. The profile allows the painter to clearly depict the woman's sagging double chin, the weight of which is accentuated by the shape of her awkwardly falling veil. Rubens really uses the painterly quality of his brushwork here to depict the wrinkles stretching over the woman's face. Unlike Anguissola misaligned eyes, Rubens' sitter gazes looking downwards so that the skin really remains the only indicator of old age. Bright pink tones contrast with paler yellow hues to create a voluminous effect and underline the roundness of the cheek. The yellow allow the flatter parts of the face to recede. The lack of female attributes imbue the sketch at the time with a certain level of androgyny, which in the contemporary setting would have suggested how age was desexualizing the woman. The heavy grey shadow placed beneath her cheekbone and jaw, as well as the white highlighting of her nose and inner corner, further emphasize Rubens' moulding of the face. And of course, working in his master's workshop, Van Dyck would have studied the way in which Rubens created such textured skin. However, if we go back to our favorite portrait, we can kind of see how Van Dyck adapts his technique. He's still alternating skin tones to create the texture of the skin, but he uses much paler colors that contrast more subtly than with one another. I think we can particularly see that on Van Dyck's right cheek. And we can see how Van Dyck has only applied a touch of darker paint above her pale cheekbone to intensify the concavity of her face. Closer to her nose, it's quite hard to see here, but he added a very small amount of red, which enriches the surface of her old skin. Anguissola's face thus appears both hollow and uniform, instead of round and fleshy. Unlike Rubens' Old Woman, Van Dyck does not rely primarily on wrinkles to mark age. Rather, it is Anguissola's vacant eyes and pale complexion that most reveal her elderliness. Now, interestingly, and I really like this idea, the fact that Van Dyck refrained from using massive wrinkles to depict his 96-year-old sitter was not really due to the fact that he was trying to hide his sitter's age. Rather, it may have acknowledged a piece of advice given to him by the old painter herself. So, as we stated before, Van Dyck wrote all of the advice that the older artist gave him during their encounter. And he noted that Anguissola had advised him to not take the light too high so that the shadows in the wrinkles of old age should not be too strong. While in this sketch, Van Dyck recorded his sitter's wrinkles with discreet but bold thin lines, he follows Anguissola's advice in the painted portrait. The frontal light protects the face from being disfigured by deeply encrusted wrinkles, escaping the fate of Rubens' Old Woman. Now, I think that Van Dyck's decision here to apply Anguissola's advice on the depiction of wrinkles suggested one way for Van Dyck to immortalize his meeting with the artist was not just to portray her, but also to directly integrate her technique within his own. And we are talking about Van Dyck here, who was a portraitist and who excelled at depicting skins and faces and embellishing them here. So I think this really emphasizes his willingness to work against the canon of old age established since the early Renaissance. So why is it so special, right, to see a woman artist as old? Well, mostly because the consensus on old age was extremely harsh in the early modern period. In his 1586 book, L'Ospedale dei Pazzi Incurabili, Tommaso Guercino included an old woman in his list of the incurable mad people. After looking at herself in the mirror, the old woman in question becomes completely mad and desperate, unable to believe this ruined image of herself. Now, Guercino's book was actually translated into French in 1620 by a doctor, suggesting that pejorative assumptions about old women were accepted as medical certainties. Meanwhile, a bit less subtle, the French poet François de Ménard stated that out of the toothless mouth of an old woman comes a putrid smell which makes the cat sneeze. The Italian satirist, Ruzzante, clearly identified the two moments that frame the life of a woman. While her early years resembled a lovely, flowery bush where all the birds flocked to sing, her older years reduced her to a skinny dog pursued by swarms of flies who devour her ears. And this would have been performed for the elite circles of Padua and Venice, and it would have really resonated with quite an ageist society. In her 2008 essay, the art historian Sheila McTighe writes about an anecdote told by the Italian artist Annibale Carracci. Carracci was asked to choose between the best of two paintings, and he was completely unable to decide. He couldn't decide which work was the best. So then he decides to turn to the most unlikely advisor, a little old woman. And the strategy here was because of her sex and age, the painting that she preferred would by definition be the weakest of the pair. So here, the presumed foolishness of the vecchierella and her inability to provide a worthy verdict underlines how stupidity and misjudgment were understood as fundamental characteristics of old women. Now don't worry, I'm not going to leave anyone out, and old men were also targeted as ridiculous and laughable figures. So Ruzzante, for instance, the same author we were talking about, commented that old age, whether attacking a woman or a man's body, was in both cases a swamp, where every sort of unhealthy water gathers. And Baldissare Castiglione opens the second book of his famous Libro del Cortegiano by criticizing old people for living in a state of nostalgic abandonment, longing for bygone times and constantly denouncing the present. But of course, it was women who were particularly targeted as victims of old age because of their alleged vanity. Indeed, if you remember Guercino's example, his old character turns mad because she's a woman whose vanity and self-image have been shaken. The same pattern appears in this famous work by Quentin Matsys, The Ugly Duchess, where the old woman's vanity blinds her from realizing how monstrous she has become. I think this really contrasts with Van Dyck's treatment of Anguissola's blindness, which was not symbolically caused by vanity, but by a lifetime of serious looking. Now, Leonardo da Vinci also distinguished between the ideal depiction of old women and old men. So, old men should be represented with slow, heavy movement, bending low, with the head leaning forwards. However, da Vinci stated that old women should be represented with eager, swift, and furious gestures like infernal furies. So, while da Vinci's ideal depiction of an old man acknowledges this decaying body, its calmness and dignity allow the man to take on the role of a wise, experienced elder. By contrast, Leonardo presents the elderly female as a hysterical madwoman. A woman's decaying body was associated with her loss of beauty, virtue, and even sanity. Consequently, the portraits made of wise and dignified old masters left no room for old mistresses. So whilst Van Dyck was in Sicily, he actually drew a witch in his sketchbook, and he might have seen her in 1624 in front of the church of San Domenico, during the only public humiliation ceremony performed while Van Dyck was in Palermo. Archives inform us that a witch was one of the 4 punished heretics, and it's possible that witnessing this may have occasioned this sketch. The large, cloaked, wrinkled figure wears a pointed hat decorated with the figure of the devil. The Spanish Inquisition was particularly relentless in its condemnation of witchcraft, and Sicily, under Spanish control at the time, was a major centre for the exposure of witches. This sketch presents the kind of stereotype against which Van Dyck worked when depicting the not too heavily wrinkled, but still clearly aging Anguissola. So while wrinkles were evidence of an elderly man's wisdom and experience, The absence of wrinkles in a woman's portrait asserted her capacity to escape the indignities of old age. Isabella d'Este, who we see here, was particularly satisfied with Titian's second portrait of her, in which her 62-year-old self was idealized as a teenage girl. Isabella d'Este actually sent Titian an earlier portrait of herself, painted by Francesco Francia, as well as precise written instructions, so that the artist could portray her in a manner that she thought befitted her public identity. Titian's painting, of course, was not really a portrait at all, but the ultimate derivation of the games of likeness, identity, and creative invention. This idealistical portrait of a powerful woman as young was really common in images of ruling women, who needed to assert their power as monarchs, whilst justifying their capacity to rule despite their gender. Writing about the rainbow portrait of Queen Elizabeth, Mary Hazard notes that the Queen's mask of youth asserts that the monarch lives in perpetual present. Nicholas Hilliard, Queen Elizabeth's official miniaturist, reports how the monarch specifically asked her to sit in the open alley of a goodly garden where no tree was near nor any shadow at all. This, of course, would have prevented any unflattering facial markings. A vital aesthetic, especially when any wrinkle could have compromised Elizabeth's power as the absolute monarch. There we go. So unlike female rulers who had to legitimize themselves as capable of fulfilling a role normally consigned to men, an aristocratic woman could sometimes assert her old age in order to suggest the strength of her lineage, or to contribute to her family's reputation. These portraits of old matrons, who were often widowed, became increasingly widespread throughout the 17th century, and ironically, Van Dyck actually played an important role in establishing their popularity. In 1621, he produced a full-length portrait of an elderly Genovese lady. Seated in a wooden armchair, she gazes directly and enigmatically out at the viewer, her slight smirk suggesting her awareness at her own elevated status. The painting is dark and bare. The woman's black dress merges into the indecipherable dark background, and she wears no eye-catching jewelry nor precious pearls. Nonetheless, the lush rendition of her velvet dress, the colourful carpet beneath her feet, and the fine detailing of her ruff all convey the woman's wealth. Her age suggests that she is the progenitor of a rich and successful family, emphasized by the use of Doric columns, sign of a venerable heritage. The sitter's red cheek, smooth hands, and slightly greying hair minimize the physical signs of old age, without denying it completely. The portrait is therefore rather an image of a noble or wealthy individual than an actual depiction of an old woman. Let's go back. There we go. So another way to understand Van Dyck's portrait of Anguissola is through the veil that she wears in her outfit. As Erin Campbell explains, old women would sometimes identify with the figure of the pious woman who, having fulfilled her role as progenitor, was bound to a life of chastity and piety. In his 1546 manual, De l'Institución de la Femina Cristiana, the author Juan Vives suggests that once a woman was freed from earthly cares, she should turn the eyes of her body to the earth, to which she must render her body, and then raise all her sense, her mind, and soul to the Lord. This view was reasserted by the Venetian engraver Cesare Vecellio, who insisted that old women should renounce the vanities of the world by dedicating themselves to the life of the spirit. Saintly figures such as Saint Elizabeth or Saint Anne would have emphasized this ideal. Now, Anguissola's costume, so many old people in these slides, let's get the right one up. And now you're all guessing which one is it going to be. There we go. So Anguissola's costume and pose recall images such as the 1557 portrait of Lucrezia Vertova by Moroni. Campbell describes this painting as depicting the moment where female old age emerges as a stage of sanctity. And also, if we think back to Van Dyck's portrait, Anguissola's dark habit could have evoked depictions of widowed women, whom Vives suggested should likewise dedicate themselves to a spiritual existence. Anguissola's black outfit and tight white collar are also indicative of the Spanish Habsburg court's preferred style of dress, which would have been worn in Sicily at the time. Therefore, I think we can argue here that Anguissola's costume functions much more as a political and geographical indicator than as a sign of widowhood or piety. Now, the Platonic idea that the old woman's body could free itself from earthly cares contrasts with Aristotle's description of the physical decrepitude of the old individual. The art historian Philip Somme underlines this difference by comparing the aging body's physical, mental, and psychological decline with its spiritual liberation from a corporeal limitation. Now, I really want you to bear that in mind. There's two differences, right? So this idea of the earthly bound body that's decaying, and then this idea of the body that's elevating itself from earth into a spiritual realm. Van Dyck's portrait, in my opinion, bridges these two incompatible views. Her old eyes reveal her as physically present, but her lost gaze frees her from the earthly realm. Indeed, her aging body is expressed through her marble skin, while her pale complexion intensifies the darkness of her bulging, blind eyes. Her blindness is seen in the slightly off-center reflection of the light in her right eye, and it fixes her stare in the state of perpetual emptiness. Now, I am French, and I try not to use Sartre in everything I do, but here, I think he kind of offers an interesting interpretation in order to look at this work. Sartre defined the gaze as the action through which an individual understands himself as a subject in relation to another person. Here, the viewer of Van Dyck's portrait is confronted by the unsettling presence of a body that does not acknowledge its role as the subject of the painting, nor as the object of the viewer's gaze. Anguissola's eyes enable her to resist the objectification inherent to portraiture, as her blind gaze cannot register the artist painting her, nor the viewer observing her. She is completely impenetrable. Her eyes offer no access to her soul. Her eyes both reveal her as a decaying body, but also her absence from any form of engagement which would bind her to the earthly realm that her viewer occupies. She becomes both a physical aging body and a metaphysical presence. I think we can link that to Van Dyck's style as well, because he's got quite a relaxed style here. If you think of his other works, it's quite a big contrast. And we can really see, I think we can interpret that possibly as the sitter's imminent passage to heaven and her escape from this earthbound life. While Anguissola's eyes reveal both her presence and her absence from the earthly realm, the looseness of Van Dyck brushstrokes intensifies the sensation of his sitter's liberation from the material world he was accustomed to painting. Therefore, while Van Dyck made Anguissola's age visible, his portrait paradoxically reveals the invisibility of old women. Painting it for himself, Van Dyck must have wanted to portray the artist as she really appeared in order to create an accurate souvenir of their encounter. He depicts her as an old woman, but unusually unburdened by any of the roles normally assigned to elderly females in the early modern period. Van Dyck reveals Anguissola uninvolved and unconcerned by the world that she cannot see. The portrait presents her as unapologetically old, while dismissing preconceived assumptions about age. Anguissola's aging body binds her to the viewer's material world, yet Van Dyck's depiction suggests a sense of removal from that exact world. Facing us, without seeing us, Van Dyck's Anguissola defies the ignored existences and depictions of old women artists. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for delivering such an engaging and insightful talk. I've noted for myself, if I ever get my portrait painted, I'll make sure they take a low light to flatter me. So just as a small gesture of this evening, I wanted to present you both, actually, with a book about Charterhouse. And if I can invite everyone everyone to make their way through to the cloister to enjoy a drink and a canapé and to interrogate both our prize winners on questions on their essays. So thank you very much.